Blackwood Lake had a way of swallowing sound. Even before John Marlowe set foot on the damp, pine-covered soil surrounding it, he felt the silence pressing against the windows of his truck, like a living thing. He'd traveled across the country for stranger cases, abandoned towns, anomalous radio frequencies, disappearances along forgotten hiking trails. But none of them carried the same weight as the letter he'd received a week ago. It was written by the younger brother of a fisherman who had vanished 3 months earlier, one of several disappearances the local police treated with resigned familiarity. But the letter didn't mention the word accident. It didn't mention drowning or misadventure. Just one line at the end. The lake glowed the night before he disappeared. That was enough to pull John out of his city apartment and into the lonely forests of Maine. The town of Blackwood was little more than a scattering of weather-beaten houses, a diner, a darkened bait shop, and a lodge that had seen better decades. People didn't look at him when he walked past. Or rather, they looked and quickly looked away, like someone avoiding a memory. At the diner, he stopped for coffee, noticing the little details that often told more truth than words. The taped newspaper clipping about a missing boat crew, the faded photo of smiling fishermen, half of them marked with red X's, and the hand-painted sign reading, "No night fishing, no exceptions." He asked a few questions, but the replies were half answers, and the room's uncomfortable quiet thickened around him. Everyone seemed to know something, and everyone seemed determined not to say it. By late afternoon, he reached the place he'd come for, Blackwood Lake. The first impression was its stillness. Not calm, but motionless, like the water wasn't resting, but waiting. The pine trees loomed around the shoreline, their reflections sharp and unmoving on the glassy surface. No birds, no insects. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. John stood at the edge and filmed the shoreline, his camera capturing the thick fog drifting across the surface even though the air was too warm for it. The silence was deeper here, more absolute, as if the lake absorbed whatever dared disturb it. He found the old ranger station near the docks, a decaying cabin with peeling paint and a sagging roof. Inside were scattered maps of the lake, some browned with age. One map caught his eye, a sonar scan taken decades ago, warped by moisture. It showed an unusually deep trench at the center, a narrow drop plunging far beyond what a lake this size should hold. A handwritten note said, "Depth inconsistent, equipment malfunction suspected." But the frantic handwriting suggested the author didn't fully believe it. As the sun dipped behind the tree line, John reviewed the file. Photos of the fishermen on his final day. Typical shots. Boats, nets, calm water. Until the last two. Something faint hovered beneath the surface. A blurred shimmer, like a distant lantern underwater. He enlarged the image, adjusted exposure, isolated the brightest portion, and there it was. A pale, soft radiance at a depth where no natural light could exist. Not a reflection, not a lens flare. Something alive. Something that pulsed. He spent the early night walking along the shore, recording footage and taking notes. Locals had warned about sudden fogs and strange tides, though the lake had no real currents. Standing alone on the wooden dock, he felt a vibration under his boots, subtle but unmistakable, as if something far beneath the surface had shifted. The dock creaked once, then fell still. He checked the time, nearly midnight, and decided to head back to his cabin. But as he turned to leave, a low, resonant hum rolled across the lake. It wasn't loud, barely above a whisper, yet it carried a pressure that settled into his bones. He looked back at the lake. At first, nothing. Then, far out toward the center, a faint glow stirred beneath the water. Weak, blurred by depth, but real enough to reflect off the underside of the fog. It pulsed once. Then again, slower this time, like a giant heartbeat. He raised his camera, zooming in, but the fog thickened suddenly, swallowing the glow entirely. The hum faded. The silence returned. John stood there for several long minutes, unsure whether to chase the phenomenon or run from it. He remembered the name the locals had whispered in the diner, almost spat out like a curse. The Fisher's Glow. And the way they said it carried a single, unmistakable warning. Those who follow the light never come back the same. As he finally turned toward the cabin, he noticed something carved into the wooden post at the end of the dock. Something he hadn't seen in the daylight. A set of deep grooves, forming a twisting geometric pattern, not like any symbol he recognized. It was recent, too recent, and it faced the lake, as if marking where someone had stood just before they vanished into the dark water. He packed up and headed back, but the last thing he heard before leaving the shoreline was that soft, distant hum, rising for a moment, then dying just as quickly, like an unspoken warning or an invitation. The glow hadn't left John's mind by the next morning. Even after hours of reviewing the footage, the image that stuck with him wasn't the faint light under the surface. It was the carved pattern on the dock post. He'd seen symbols before on past investigations, some carved by frightened locals, some left behind by people sinking into obsession, but this one felt different. The lines weren't random scratches. They looped and folded into themselves with intention, as if the person who carved them was trying to replicate something they had seen. John traced the grooves with his finger and felt a strange chill, not of cold, but of recognition, as though his mind tried to complete the pattern without knowing how. The day grew foggier than the last, a thick, wet haze settling over the lake and forest. Locals avoided going outside, even in daylight. John noticed something else, too. The town wasn't just quiet. It was emptying out. Houses with open windows but no lights inside. Boats tied to docks with no footprints leading anywhere. It felt less like people had left, and more like they chose to retreat indoors after something brushed too close to their lives. He headed to the lodge's basement, where old town records were stored. The air was stale with mildew and dust, but the shelves overflowed with reports, fishing logs, local legends, and handwritten testimonies from people who claimed to see lights on the water. The earliest documented mention was from 1896, a trapper describing soft lantern glow drifting beneath the ice. Each decade had similar sightings, always at night, always near the lake's trench, always followed by missing persons within days. But what unsettled John most were the drawings. Ancient, crude sketches from long-dead witnesses depicting spiraling geometric shapes that mirrored the carving he found on the dock. Different witnesses, different centuries, same pattern. He decided to rent a small boat from the bait shop, leaving a note when he found the door locked and the interior abandoned. Behind the building, he found a rowboat tied loosely to a post. The wood was old, but sturdy enough. He loaded his camera equipment, the sonar scanner, and an emergency kit before pushing off into the still water. The lake's surface was unnervingly smooth, like pushing through liquid glass. Even the ripples from the oars seemed to vanish faster than they formed. As he rowed toward the lake's center, the fog thinned just enough to reveal the faint outline of the tree line, but kept everything else muted and gray. The silence grew heavier the farther he drifted, and the deeper the water became. When he reached the approximate location of the trench, He dropped the sonar sensor into the water. The machine hummed as it scanned the depths until it froze. The display flickered, stuttered, and showed impossible numbers. Depth readings plunging into hundreds of meters, then thousands, far beyond anything a lake could hold. The machine vibrated, overheated, and shut down entirely. John pulled the sensor back up, but the cable was warm, almost hot, as if something deep below had tampered with it. Before he could process the malfunction, a faint vibration rippled through the boat. It wasn't from the water beneath him, but from the air around him, a low resonance that made the metal clasps of his equipment tremble softly. He steadied himself, scanning the fog. The resonance deepened, grew harsher, then abruptly cut off, leaving the silence, even heavier than before. The water shifted beneath him. At first, he thought it was a fish surfacing, but the motion was too smooth, too deliberate. A pale light emerged deep below, muted but unmistakable. The glow expanded slowly, forming ripples of shimmering blues and greens, swirling like bioluminescent tides trapped in darkness. John leaned over the edge, holding his camera steady, but the glow pulsed sharply. Once, twice, each beat growing brighter. Then something else happened, something he felt more than saw. His thoughts stretched. It was as if his mind reached forward without his control, pulled by something unseen. For a moment, the shimmering patterns beneath the surface formed shapes his mind tried desperately to interpret. Not words, not images, but geometry. Impossible geometry that twisted wrong in his perception. A faint warmth rose behind his eyes, and he realized his vision had blurred for a moment. The glow dimmed suddenly, collapsing inward like a closing shutter. The boat rocked with the sudden withdrawal, sending small waves across the lake. John fell backward onto the floorboards, heart racing, breath shaking. He wiped the light trickle that had formed under his nose, steadying himself as he forced his hands not to tremble. By the time he gathered the courage to look over the edge again, the glow was gone, completely gone, as if it had never been there at all. He rowed back to shore as quickly as he could, but as he pulled the boat onto the dock, he noticed something chilling. The geometric symbol carved into the wooden post had changed. The lines were deeper, more deliberate, and a new spiral had appeared at its center, one he hadn't seen before. He touched the carving and froze. It was warm. Something beneath Blackwood Lake had seen him, and now it was imitating him. For the rest of the night, Elias stayed awake, listening to the old cabin breathe around him like something alive. The lake was only a short walk downhill, but somehow it felt closer, as if it had crept up while he wasn't looking. Every so often, a faint radiance seeped through the cracks between the wooden boards. Not bright enough to be real light, but just enough to make him feel as though something was waiting outside. Patient, unmoving, unblinking. When dawn finally came, the forest didn't warm the way it usually did. The air remained chilled, heavy, and oddly metallic, like breathing through a handful of old keys. Elias packed his gear slower than usual, feeling a strange tightness in his muscles he couldn't fully explain. His thoughts felt crowded. There was something new in his mind. Not a memory, not a sensation, but a presence. A quiet echo of a voice that had not yet spoken. He told himself he would take one more dive before calling the expedition off. One more documented descent, enough to prove to the Institute that Blackwood Lake wasn't suitable for extended surveys. Enough to secure funding for the next site. Enough to leave this place behind before it wore down the edges of his clarity. He walked the familiar dirt path to the water, each step landing heavier than the last. The lake was strangely calm that morning, a sheet of slate-colored glass interrupted only by thin lines of mist drifting low across its surface. The cold reached through his wetsuit before he even touched the water, but he pressed on, trying to keep his breathing steady. The dive began without incident. He descended through layers of cold, watching the sunlight fade until the world narrowed into a dim corridor of suspended silt. He checked his gauges. Depth normal. Pressure normal. Oxygen normal. Everything normal, except the way the water felt, as if it wasn't pressing on him, but holding him, securing him, claiming him. Then he saw it again, not as a shape, but as a color that didn't exist in nature. A pulse, a slow shimmer at the edge of his vision that moved not like light, but like a thought. Elias turned toward it, despite every instinct urging caution. The glow was deeper this time, not a distant glimmer, but a low hovering bloom of luminescence rising from the lakebed like living mist. It swirled in slow spirals, bending the water around it, shaping it into impossible geometries that his mind recognized but could not comprehend. His heart raced, yet he felt no fear. Only a widening curiosity, as though something unseen guided his gaze gently forward. The patterns within the light folded and unfolded with uncanny precision. They were symbols, not random, not chaotic, structured, familiar in a way that defied reason. Something inside him began to thrum in response, as though a part of his mind was being tuned to a frequency he had always carried but never noticed. He descended closer without meaning to. His legs kicked automatically, drawn downward by an instinct that didn't feel like his own. He felt pressure building behind his forehead, a warm bloom low in his spine, and the faintest whisper inside his mind. Not words, not yet, but intent, purpose, communication. The shimmering vortex pulsed again, and for a fractured moment, he thought he saw faces inside it. Human shapes, outlines of hands reaching outward, eyes glowing with that same impossible light. Then the shapes rippled away, like reflections disturbed by a passing breeze. A sudden noise cut through the water, a crackling vibration that rattled his mask. Elias jolted, snapping out of the trance just enough to check his equipment. His radio was hissing with a frequency he didn't recognize. Low, distorted, rhythmic. He froze. It wasn't static. It was a pattern. 3 tones rising, 1 falling, repeating, insistent, beckoning. His breathing faltered, bubbles surging upward as he tried to force his body to obey him instead of the invisible pull of the light. When he finally kicked upward, pushing himself away from the glow, the water resisted him like thick syrup. The light pulsed faster. The silt rose in spirals, coiling around his legs like drifting tendrils. For a moment, he feared the lake would not let him go. But then, the glow dimmed. Not retreating, but watching, and the pressure on his body loosened just enough for him to start ascending. He broke the surface in a gasping, trembling panic, ripping off his mask and coughing as the cold air hit his lungs. The sky above had turned unnaturally gray despite the early hour, and the tree line shivered in a wind he couldn't feel on his own skin. The whole world seemed slightly off rhythm, wrong by a fraction of a second. As Elias swam toward the shore, something brushed against his leg. Not physical, not tangible, but an afterimage, a lingering thread of the glow that felt like it had seeped into him like ink into paper. By the time he reached land, his hands were shaking uncontrollably, not from cold, not from shock, from recognition. When he blinked, faint luminous shapes flickered behind his eyelids, shapes he now recognized as symbols, and he understood them, not fully, but enough to frighten him, enough to realize they weren't meant for humans, enough to know they weren't meant to be seen at all. He staggered back toward the cabin, tripping over roots, one hand pressed to his chest as a dull ache radiated outward from his sternum. Each heartbeat felt out of sync with the world around him, as though something inside had been subtly rewired by the encounter. When he reached the deck, he looked down at his forearm and froze. Thin, faint, bioluminescent lines were appearing beneath his skin. Spirals, angles, patterns identical to those he had seen in the depths. They pulsed softly, mirroring the rhythm of the glow he had witnessed. Elias dropped to his knees, clutching his arm, forcing his breath to slow, to steady. The symbols pulsed once more, and the whisper in his mind finally sharpened into a single resonant impression, a message not spoken but placed. Come back. Not a request, a summons. And far below the lake's dark surface, the luminary answered its own call, brightening in a slow, hungry pulse that made the water shiver. John barely slept that night. Even when he closed his eyes, the glow flickered behind his eyelids. Not as a memory, but as if something beneath the lake were replaying the moment on purpose, reminding him it hadn't vanished, only withdrawn. His dreams stretched into abstract shapes and spirals he couldn't comprehend. Each time he woke, the pattern carved on the dock felt burned brighter into his mind. By morning, he felt disoriented, slightly nauseous, unable to shake the sensation that something had followed him home from the water. The lodge felt colder than usual, and the silence had changed. It wasn't absence of noise, it was expectation, as though the air were waiting for him to make the next move. When he splashed water on his face in the bathroom mirror, he noticed faint dark circles under his eyes, and something else. A geometric pattern barely visible at the edge of his right iris. He blinked hard and stepped back. The pattern vanished. He told himself it was fatigue, nothing more. He returned to his notes and footage, trying to make sense of everything. When he reviewed the audio captured on the lake, he heard something unusual. A low-frequency hum, almost too deep to notice consciously, that wasn't present during recording. The hum pulsed with a rhythm too precise to be natural. At certain intervals, it layered with faint higher tones that almost formed a pattern. Not music, not language. Something between, something structured. As he listened, the hair on his arms lifted, and the air around him thickened as if the atmosphere itself were reacting. He stopped the playback, and the feeling vanished instantly. He rewound the file and played it again. The heaviness returned, synchronized perfectly with the hum. It wasn't interference. It wasn't glitch or weather. It wasn't sonar feedback. It was communication. He closed the laptop, shaken, and stepped outside for fresh air. But when he approached the shoreline, the fog moved differently. Not drifting, not swirling, but drawing inward toward a single point above the water, as if pulled. And something was waiting there, a figure, or what resembled one. At first, it looked like a silhouette standing knee-deep in the lake, unmoving, facing the shore. John froze. The shape was too still to be human, too sharp in outline for fog, and yet too vague to identify. He stepped forward, and the silhouette dissolved instantly, as if it had never existed, leaving only a faint shimmer trailing across the water before it faded into stillness. His phone vibrated in his pocket. No number, just a single message containing symbols, geometric spirals identical to the ones carved on the dock. He stared at the screen, stunned. There was no signal out here, no towers for miles. The lodge didn't even have working landlines. The lake had sent him a message. The realization hit him harder than fear or logic. Something beneath Blackwood Lake wasn't just reacting to him. It was learning him, understanding him, finding new ways to reach him. Whatever he'd witnessed in the water wasn't just an organism or an anomaly. It was intelligent, curious, adaptive. He felt a sudden, sharp ringing inside his head, high-pitched, piercing. His vision blurred. He dropped to his knees, hands bracing his temples as the sound intensified. His eyes watered, and behind the pressure came flashes. Not images, but impressions of places that shouldn't exist. Vast structures of spiraling light. Towering forms rising from immeasurable depths. And at the center of it all, a sphere of shimmering brilliance. The luminary. He gasped awake on the dock, lying flat on the wooden boards. He had no memory of collapsing, no memory of passing out. His phone was in his hand, its screen cracked, the symbols gone. He sat up slowly, breath shaky. The lake looked the same, silent, gray, calm. But a new carving had appeared on the dock beside him. Fresh, deep, unmistakable. It depicted a human figure standing at the water's edge, and behind it, a larger shape, a floating sphere of spiraling light. John stepped back from the carving, heart pounding. The message was clear. The luminary wasn't just observing him anymore. It wanted him to come closer. And part of him, a quiet, unwelcome part, wanted to obey. John stood at the edge of the dock long after the fog had settled thick around the lake, long after the last trace of sunlight withdrew behind the pines. He knew he should step away, return to the lodge, pack his equipment, leave Blackwood Lake entirely. Every instinct he'd built over years of investigating the unknown told him the same thing. Leave, before you lose yourself. Yet something in him no longer responded to instinct or fear. A quiet pull, subtle, unyielding, tugged at the edges of his thoughts like threads loosening from old fabric. The luminary wasn't forcing him, it was inviting him. And what unsettled him most was how steady his legs felt each time he edged closer to the water. The humming tone from the recording now resonated faintly in the air itself, rising, falling, a slow, rhythmic pulse. It was everywhere, in the boards beneath his feet, in the mist above the water, in the shallow breaths he couldn't fully control. The hum wasn't sound anymore. It was atmosphere, presence, awareness. He could feel it acknowledging him, studying him, adjusting itself for him. The patterns behind his eyes flickered faster now, cascading spirals flowing in and out like tides in reverse, as if his mind had become a projection surface for something ancient and hidden. He forced himself to turn away and stumbled back toward the lodge, every step heavier than the last. Inside, his equipment lay scattered where he'd left it. The sonar scanner burned faintly against the floorboards, still hot to the touch. Papers covered in sketches and notes littered the table, and on top of them, his notebook lay open to a page he didn't remember drawing. The same pattern, perfect spirals he could never have carved consciously. Lines too precise, curves too exact. His own handwriting filled the margins with symbols no longer recognizable as letters. He slammed the notebook shut and shoved it aside, trying to steady his breath. but the air felt wrong, as if it shifted between temperatures, moving from warm to freezing in seconds, like the building itself was breathing around him. The lights flickered, dimmed, and finally faded, until only the faint glow of his laptop remained. On its black screen, without any input from him, shapes began to appear. Spirals folding into spirals, forming moving diagrams that twisted into three-dimensional illusions. He stepped back, heart tightening as he recognized they were not random. They were maps, depth maps, of the trench. The screen pulsed once, then shifted to a single, sharp frame. A glowing sphere rising out of darkness, surrounded by smaller shapes moving around it like moons orbiting a star. The image brightened into white, and the laptop shut itself off. John stood frozen. The luminary was no longer just showing him things. It was choosing what he saw. He grabbed his coat, stumbled outside, and headed back toward the dock, desperate for clarity, for closure, for something that could make sense of the impossible patterns tightening around his thoughts. The fog parted for him as he walked, not randomly, but deliberately, clearing a silent path straight to the water. When he reached the shoreline, the lake surface was unnaturally still, reflecting nothing, absorbing everything. A pale shimmer bloomed beneath the surface. It grew brighter by the second, expanding outward in flawless circular waves that bent and warped as if refracted through a lens of water and light. The hum deepened in frequency, vibrating through his ribs, echoing at the back of his skull. John stepped onto the dock, knees weak but steady, eyes fixed on the pulsing glow rising from the depths like a heartbeat. The luminary ascended slowly, not breaking the surface but hovering just beneath it. Its light was softer now, shifting between whites, blues, and faint gold. Patterns glided across its surface, spirals, lines, forms that danced and merged, never stopping, never repeating. The light wasn't blinding, it was beautiful, comforting, familiar, in a way that frightened him more than any unknown ever had. He felt calm, too calm. Thoughts that should have sparked panic instead sank like stones into deep water. He tried to step back, but his body felt anchored, held by a pull that reached deeper than muscle. The hum rose in pitch, and suddenly images flooded his mind, faster than he could process. Vast underwater chasms lit by shifting constellations. Structures built of geometry beyond human comprehension. And something else. Something like a civilization that communicated without language, without sound, through form, pattern, and light. It wasn't showing him destruction or malice. It was showing him understanding. A realization seeped into him slowly, as inevitable as the tide. The luminary didn't lure people to harm them. It lured those who could receive it, because it needed them. The water around the glow rippled inward, as though something massive shifted far below. A second light emerged beside the first, dimmer, as though newly formed. A smaller sphere, mimicking the patterns of the larger one, but imperfectly, clumsily. A learning shape, a shaping shape. Another ripple, a third. John's breath caught. They weren't lights, they were minds, projections, copies. And one of them, the smallest, pulsed in perfect synchrony with the rhythm in his head. He stumbled backward, horrified as understanding crashed into him like cold water. The luminary wasn't just communicating with him. It was replicating him, or something inside him. Thoughts, memories, impulses, converted into geometry, into light, into pattern. He turned to run and stopped. A silhouette stood at the tree line. Not fog, not shadow. A person. The figure stepped forward slowly, and as the fog thinned, John saw the face. His face. Pale, expressionless, eyes glowing faintly with the same impossible light drifting beneath the surface of the lake. The double tilted its head at an unnatural angle, studying him, testing its new form. Then it smiled, a slow, incomplete motion, like a creature attempting to imitate something it didn't yet fully understand. Behind him, the water glowed brighter. Behind him, the humming rose into a near luminous vibration. Behind him, the luminary waited. John felt the world narrow to a single point of instinct, raw, human. Run. But he didn't know if he could outrun something that had already stepped into his shape, something that now knew how to walk in his skin. He stepped back slowly, every nerve trembling, every thought fighting the pull of the deep. The duplicate lifted its hand, mirroring him perfectly. The lake pulsed once, a final, blinding shimmer, and the world went white. I didn't plan to stumble into anything supernatural. I wasn't hunting mysteries. I wasn't chasing internet legends. All I wanted was a replacement SD card for my old camera. The one I found wasn't even supposed to be unusual. Just a cheap online auction listing. Scratched, unlabeled, 32 gigabyte mixed files. No description, no seller's name, no return address. It looked like someone shoved it into an envelope just to get rid of it. When it arrived, the plastic casing was chipped, and faint burn-like marks ran along the edge, as though it had overheated or been exposed to moisture. Still, it worked the moment I inserted it, though barely. The card contained 86 files. Most were corrupted beyond recovery. Black screens, broken audio, flickers of static. But the intact ones were short video fragments, the kind you'd see from helmet cams or backpack-mounted recorders. The timestamps were from only a few weeks ago, and the metadata, embedded in every playable file, carried the same two names: Lance Harrow Cam 1 and Ava Miller Cam 1. I didn't know who they were then. Later, I'd learned they were known in certain hiking circles, experienced backpackers, wilderness bloggers, the kind of people who could climb half a mountain before breakfast and still complain that the trail was too easy. They'd been missing for 9 days. The first restored clip showed them packing gear in the trunk of a dusty Subaru. Early morning light washed the gravel road, outlining tall pines in gold. They joked, they laughed. Two friends heading out for another adventure. Their destination? Black Ridge. Remote, thinly mapped, way up in the northern forests. They mentioned Trail 73, an unmaintained route through old logging territory. Local folklore talked about an abandoned silver mine called Horizon Shaft. Most people considered the story a tourist trap fantasy. The second clip felt different. They were deep in the forest now. Sunlight slanting through cedar crowns, the ground thick with old needles. Lance panned the camera slowly, circling the trees. His breathing was calm, practiced, the breathing of someone accustomed to long hikes. Ava pointed at a wooden sign nailed to a stump, half rotten. T73 carved into it with a knife. The area around it looked untouched for years. No footprints, no campers, nothing disturbed. Only silence. The heavy, chest-deep kind.
As I kept restoring the files, a creeping sensation grew that these videos weren't meant to be watched. Many clips were only seconds long, yet captured strange, subtle details. A tree with bark peeled impossibly high, a patch of moss arranged in a spiral, rocks stacked deliberately, half collapsed. And then the first symbol appeared. A geometric carve on a cedar trunk, a circle intersected by two angled lines, deeper than a pocket knife could cut, smooth, precise, carved with something stronger. Lance zoomed in on it. Ava brushed her fingers along the carved edges, laughing quietly, like she'd just stumbled across trail graffiti. Neither of them seemed bothered. Neither understood the weight of the symbol, or how many more would follow. Back then, it was just another strange detail in an unfamiliar forest. One longer clip, nearly 2 minutes, showed them hiking along a narrowing trail. The forest looked denser than in earlier videos, the canopy thicker, daylight dimmer. The soundscape wrong. No birds, no wind, just an unnerving stillness, as though the air itself was listening. Their footsteps were the only consistent noise. It was the first time I noticed something odd in the audio frequencies, a faint, low hum, barely perceptible, rising and dipping with the camera's motion. At the time, I thought it was interference. Near the end of that hike, the trail opened into a small clearing. The camera shook slightly as Lance set his pack down.
The clearing looked like a place where people once camped. Scattered stones forming an old fire ring. Rusted hooks hammered into a log as if someone had hung equipment there years ago. A fallen tree nearby had markings carved into it, but the recording was too damaged to reveal their shapes. Still, the place felt abandoned, left hurriedly, without ceremony. Then came the file that told me this wasn't ordinary lost hiker footage. The video opened with Lance standing still, camera aimed into a cluster of fir trees. At first, nothing moved. Dark trunks, dense brush. Then, as the camera stabilized, I saw something softer than shadow shift between the trees. A shape. Not animal, not falling branch. Something large moving silently from one trunk to the next. Too obscured to understand, but unmistakably bipedal. It didn't step, it drifted. Ava whispered something from behind the camera, but the audio glitched sharply, the pitch warping. Lance took one step backward, and the video cut out. That's where the first part of their journey ends, in uncertainty, in the first quiet hints that something was wrong in the forest. But at that point, they kept moving forward, unaware that Trail 73 would lead them into the darkest days of their lives. The next sequence of files showed a shift so subtle you wouldn't notice it unless you watched the clips one after another without pause. Exactly the way I did. The light in the forest was wrong. Not darker, just duller, as if the sun itself was losing interest in illuminating the ground. Each timestamp said it was still midday, yet the shadows were longer, thinner, sharper. The air felt denser through the lens. Lance and Ava didn't seem to notice. If anything, they looked energized, motivated by the strange symbol they'd found earlier. Their pace was steady, confident, purposeful. They had no idea that something had already started following them. In one clip, Ava walked ahead, brushing branches aside, the tall ferns closing behind her like slow-moving doors. She stopped, glancing down. The camera zoomed in on a set of tracks. Not boots, not hooves. Wide, flat, spaced unnaturally far apart, as if made by something enormous yet impossibly light. The edges were crisp, fresh. No mud displaced, no debris dragged, as though the forest had cooperated to shape the prints for them to find. Ava joked softly, probably assuming they belonged to an elk. But Lance didn't respond. His breathing shifted, uneven, tight. The camera lingered on the prints too long. Then he turned away without a word. Deeper along the trail, the forest thickened into older growth. Towering redwoods with swollen, gnarled roots twisting across the ground like petrified serpents. Several trees were marked with the same symbol they'd found earlier. But this time, the carvings were deeper, more intricate, arranged in a repeating pattern along the left side of the trail. Too precise to be coincidence. A boundary, a warning, or both. The hikers, though, treated it like an interesting discovery, not a threat. In one fragment, the camera caught a visible tremble in a nearby trunk, though there was no wind, no movement in the canopy, no falling debris, just a single, slow shudder, like something large brushed past it on the other side. Then came the longest file so far, nearly 6 minutes of uninterrupted recording. Lance must have forgotten to turn off the camera, because the next file began with the crunch of footsteps on dirt and the quiet rhythm of his breathing. The trail wound upward onto a narrow ridge. From this height, the forest extended endlessly below, a thick green ocean stretching toward hazy mountains in the distance. But despite the open view, something in the landscape was wrong. Too few bird calls, no insects, no rustle of creatures in the brush. Nature was holding its breath. They descended the far side of the ridge, entering a darker slope where moss hung from branches like old curtains. The camera caught something reflective wedged between two exposed roots. Lance crouched and pulled out a piece of metal, an old canteen, crushed nearly flat. The aluminum bent as though by enormous pressure. It wasn't rusted. It looked recent. Too recent. The camera shook as he turned it over. Along the edge were teeth marks, not serrated like an animal's. Clean, straight, mechanical. I replayed that frame dozens of times. Those marks were not made by anything natural. As the trail narrowed, the trees grew so dense the camera darkened automatically. Even with the brightness raised, you could barely see more than a few feet ahead. Lance whispered something, but the audio fractured, stretching unnaturally before snapping back into clarity. A moment later, both hikers froze. The camera fixed forward. Between the trunks, something pale moved. Too tall to be human, too smooth in its motion. It slipped behind a cedar without disturbing a single branch. Then another shape followed, identical in height and color, visible for only a fraction of a second. The forest fell completely silent. Ava reached for her pack, probably searching for bear spray, but Lance motioned for her to stay still. His hand trembled as he adjusted the camera. The forest tightened around them, shadows stretching longer than they should, pressing inward. The atmosphere shifted from eerie to predatory. Something was watching them, studying them, deciding. The next clip was corrupted, but what remained was enough to unravel the calm facade of their journey. The video began with the camera facing the ground. Scuffed dirt, broken sticks, nothing else. The audio was pure static, broken only by sharp, irregular snaps that might have been footsteps. When the camera lifted, it revealed a clearing they hadn't seen before. Circular, unnaturally symmetrical. The ground swept clean of every leaf, branch, every natural trace. And in the center, a pattern carved into the soil, the same symbol from the trees, but larger, much larger. A perfect circle cut through by angled lines, spanning nearly 10 feet across. Ava walked toward it slowly, mesmerized. Lance whispered something, but the audio refused to carry his voice, syllables warping into digital fractures. The camera zoomed in. The grooves were deep, clean, freshly cut, too sharp for a stick, too controlled for claws, almost surgical. Then the forest echoed with a single, distant sound, a long, low groan vibrating like bending metal. Not an animal, not wind. Something massive shifting its weight. Ava froze. Lance stepped backward. The camera jolted violently as he turned, scanning the trees. Nothing moved. Nothing stirred. But the groan came again, closer this time. And then the video ended. Mid-breath, mid-movement, mid-terror. Whatever was stalking them had finally stepped into their world, no longer content to hide in the shadows. The next file started without warning, the corrupted end of one clip bleeding directly into the next. At first, the footage was nearly unwatchable, overexposed, white streaks smearing across the frame as if the camera had been pointed at the sun. Then, slowly, the light drained away. The forest snapped back into focus. Lance was running. The camera thrashed violently, ricocheting off branches, catching only disorienting flashes of trees rushing past. His breathing was fast and uneven, ragged, panic-filled, the kind of breath that starts long before a camera ever begins recording. Behind him, something enormous shattered through the undergrowth. Each impact hit the ground heavy enough to feel through the speakers, as if the earth itself absorbed the weight. A few seconds later, he stumbled into a shallow ravine. The camera tumbled into the dirt, landing sideways. For a moment, the frame showed nothing but dead leaves, scattered pine needles, and the blurred outline of Lance leaning against a fallen log. He wasn't calling for Ava. He wasn't calling for help. He was silent. Too silent. His eyes were locked on something outside the frame, something he wouldn't turn his back on. His entire body trembled, though he tried desperately to stay still. Slowly, very slowly, he crouched and reached for the camera. His hand paused mid-air, shaking uncontrollably, before he finally grabbed it and lifted it toward his face. Sweat ran down his temple. His pupils were blown wide, swallowing the color of his irises. He tried to speak, but the words never made it into the recording. Every attempt collapsed into digital distortion, as if the device itself refused to preserve whatever he was trying to confess. Half-formed syllables rose and fell unnaturally, twisting into warped echoes that felt wrong even at normal playback speed. He turned the camera toward the ridge behind him. Something was there. Not clearly visible, just motion between the tall columns of trees. Something pale, something tall, something that didn't move like anything made of muscle or bone. It drifted between trunks without sound. Each time it shifted, the camera glitched. A flicker, a frame tear, as though its presence interfered with the recording itself. Lance backed away, holding the camera tight against his chest. The next section cut abruptly to later in the day. The sun was lower now, casting long bars of amber light across the forest floor. Lance had climbed a series of steep switchbacks, his footsteps scraping against loose rock. But his hand, the same hand that had trembled violently before, was steady now. Too steady. His breathing slow, methodical, almost rehearsed. Something in him had shifted. At the top of the hill, the forest opened into another clearing. This one looked natural, messy, uneven, shaped by fallen trees and tangled brush. But right in the center lay Ava's backpack. The sight of it should have sent him running, shouting her name. Instead, he stood perfectly still, staring. Something about the way the pack rested on the ground felt staged. No signs of struggle, no scattered gear, no footprints leading away. Just the backpack, waiting. He approached slowly. The camera drifted inches above the fabric as he unzipped it. Inside were neatly folded clothes, a small pouch, a water filter, a notebook, and her phone. He pressed the power button. The screen lit up instantly. No cracks, no dirt, fully charged. As if someone, or something, had placed it there with care. The footage captured a close-up of the phone's black screen, reflecting the sky above. The forest around him was perfectly still. Not a single branch swayed. Then, in the reflection, something moved behind him. Visible only for a moment, indistinct, but tall, towering. He didn't react. Either he didn't notice, or he was pretending not to notice. He tucked Ava's phone into his own pocket, zipped her bag shut, and began walking again, deeper into the forest, not back toward the trail. As he moved, the sunlight dimmed unnaturally, like an eclipse slowly passing across the canopy. The next clip showed him setting up camp, but not in a place any hiker would choose. He was surrounded by dead trees, their trunks hollowed out and blackened, as if scorched from within. The ground was uneven, littered with long, deep grooves, claw-like at first glance, but arranged in straight, parallel lines, too precise for any animal. Lance set the camera on a fallen log and began assembling his tent with slow, deliberate motions, as though he were following unseen instructions. At one point, he paused and looked over his shoulder. The forest behind him stretched into silhouettes, shifting shadows. A faint glow flickered between the trees. Just a pulse, quick and soft, like a heartbeat of cold light. His expression didn't change. He simply kept building the tent. When night finally fell, the camera recorded with surprising clarity. The forest was pitch black, but the device adjusted just enough to reveal outlines and movement. Lance sat inside the tent, illuminated only by the pale glow of a lantern. His face was expressionless, his skin slightly paler than before. He stared into the camera for a long time, breathing evenly, never blinking. Outside, the forest was silent at first. Then a distant sound broke through. A slow, resonant hum. Deep, vibrating, like something enormous moving beneath the earth. The sound grew louder, closer, more deliberate. And then the tent walls shifted inward, just slightly, as if a massive presence had passed by, brushing the fabric without touching it. The clip ended there. The next video was timestamped 3:12 a.m. Lance was no longer in the tent. The 3:12 a.m. file opened with the camera lying on its side inside the tent. The lens fogged slightly as if someone had breathed heavily against it before leaving. The lantern was still on, casting an anemic yellow glow across the fabric walls. The sleeping bag was open, empty. Lance's boots were gone. His pack, once half-zipped, now hung wide open, as though someone had rifled through it in a hurry. or with meticulous intent. For almost 20 seconds, nothing moved. Then the tent fabric stirred, pushed inward by a faint breeze that shouldn't have existed in a forest that still and heavy. The trees outside hadn't swayed in hours, yet the tent shifted as though something large had drifted past again, brushing the ground, creating a pressure wave the way deep-sea creatures displace water. The lantern flickered twice and died, dropping the frame into darkness. The recording continued, but the forest breathed. A slow inhale, an impossibly long exhale, rhythmic, measured, not wind, something that understood rhythm. The tent poles creaked, reacting to a shift in pressure. Then, silence, abrupt, as if the camera had been squeezed or smothered. The file ended. The next recording appeared at dawn. The camera had been moved, deliberately, placed on a stump at the edge of a massive clearing. Mist pooled in the low grass, rolling in slow waves like something alive, unwilling to retreat from the rising sun. Lance stood 10 feet away, his back to the camera. He wasn't moving, just staring ahead at something the lens couldn't see. As the light strengthened, more details emerged. His clothes were torn, not ripped, but opened in precise, linear cuts. His skin, usually tan from years of hiking, had taken on a pale, ashen tone. He looked like someone who had not slept in days, or someone whose mind had been stretched far beyond its limits. The camera caught faint murmurs from him. At first, hazy syllables like someone talking from the far end of a dream. But slowly they sharpened. Not words, not English, not any human language. Repeating, spiraling syllables, patterns more than speech, spoken as if remembered rather than understood. Eventually, Lance turned slightly. The camera caught half his face. Blank. Drained. Eyes unfocused, yet tracking something moving in front of him. Something outside the frame. And then the forest dimmed despite the rising sun. That night, I opened the drawer to check the SD card again, half convinced it would be gone. It wasn't. But something else was. The wooden bottom of the drawer had symbols carved into it. Deep. Fresh. The same symbols from the trees, from the trail marker, from the dirt beside the burned camera. And at the center of them, carved deeper than the rest, was a single phrase. We're still here. I haven't gone back to Trail 73. I won't. But last night, around 3 in the morning, I noticed a faint glow outside my apartment window. Not bright, just enough to outline the edge of the curtains. Just enough to outline tall shapes that shouldn't have been able to reach the 3rd floor. Just enough to remind me of one thing. Eyes make doors. And this story, you watched it. Which means you opened one. Shadows thickened unnaturally between the pines, collecting into a single point deep in the clearing. The camera struggled to adjust, flickering between exposure levels. The darkness wasn't natural. It behaved like a physical object, stretching across the ground toward Lance like liquid ink. He didn't move. He didn't even blink as the shadow enveloped the space around him. The murmurs he'd been reciting grew louder. Not emotional, but steadier, controlled, like a chant memorized perfectly. The footage cut out, hard, replaced by a midday clip that hit like whiplash. The forest now looked violently disturbed. Deep furrows slashed the earth, some as wide as tire tracks, but they curved unpredictably, snaking into the distance like drag marks from something massive pulled through the soil. Several trees were splintered, torn down not by storm or decay, but by brute force. Yet there was no sign of Lance. Instead, the camera pointed straight at the entrance to the abandoned mine. Its wooden supports leaned inward, partially collapsed, the ground around them scarred with fresh gouges. A faint vibration hummed from deep inside, low enough to be felt more than heard. The recording glitched every time the lens focused on the darkness of the shaft, as if the camera itself resisted documenting whatever was within. Then, suddenly, inexplicably, Lance appeared in frame again. Not walking into the shot, not emerging from behind a tree. He was simply there, standing a few feet from the mine entrance. Lance stared into the void with the same hollow expression as before. His clothes were dusted with a fine layer of black sediment, the kind that coats old tunnels. His hands hung at his sides, palms open and raw, smeared with dirt as if he had been crawling. He did not speak. He did not move. The camera zoomed slightly, on its own. Lance's head twitched, not toward the camera, but upward, toward the treetops, as if hearing something high above. The forest fell silent, every sound swallowed whole. Then the mine exhaled. A single gust of cold air blasted outward, scattering dust across the ground and blowing Lance's hair back from his forehead. He didn't react. He leaned forward, almost imperceptibly, drawn toward the darkness like metal toward a magnet. The vibration deep within the mine pulsed faster now, layered, complex, like multiple rhythms stacking over one another. Something scraped against stone far inside, slow, deliberate, massive. The camera glitched violently, colors inverted. The frame tore horizontally as if stretched from within. And then a shape moved deep inside the mine. No clean outline, no sharp edges, just motion. Enormous, deliberate. Something tall enough to brush the ceiling. A faint bioluminescent flicker glowed from within its form, the same sickly pale light seen in Lance's earlier footage. The glow revealed only a fraction of the figure, but it was enough to understand one thing. It was coming forward. Lance stepped closer. A sharp crack exploded through the audio, either the camera breaking or something striking it. The file terminated. There were only 2 videos left on the SD card. Here's the final part of the footage. Before we begin, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next case I managed to dig up. Because what you're about to hear is the reason I will never go into the woods alone again. I didn't sleep the night I finished going through Daniel and Mara's last files. I kept replaying the final corrupted segment in different editors, enhancing shadows, slowing frames, isolating audio. Nothing made the shapes less impossible. Eventually, I went back through the folder, every raw clip, every still, every metadata line. And that's when I noticed it. Timestamps that didn't match reality. Files created hours before the camera could have been powered on. GPS coordinates jumping hundreds of meters between frames. And most disturbing of all, a folder that hadn't been there before. Trail 73 rendered. It held only one video file. No thumbnail, no duration, no codec metadata. Just the name, We're Still Here.mp4. I shouldn't have opened it, but I did. The screen stayed black for several seconds. Then, a breathing sound. Wet, strained, as if coming through waterlogged speakers. Light bled slowly into the darkness. Not digital exposure, but a glow inside the frame, a bioluminescent haze growing from within. It revealed Daniel, or what used to be Daniel, sitting on the forest floor, face gray and drained, pupils blown wide as if staring at something I couldn't see. His lips weren't moving, but his voice was whispering beneath the static, rapid, impossible syllables. Not a language, a geometry. Phonemes bending around each other like something folding in a dimension we don't speak. Behind him, tall shapes, trees at first, began to bend in unnatural arcs, like joints bending the wrong way. Then another glow entered the frame, smaller, softer, pulsing. Mara. She stepped into view as though emerging from a tear in the air, her clothes drenched, her skin slick with something that reflected light like oil. Her mouth opened, and this time the voice matched. "Turn it off." She didn't shout, she whispered. But the audio peaked so violently I had to lower the volume. Her eyes rolled upward toward the canopy, as if something enormous had leaned over them. "It's learning," she said. "It follows anything that watches." The camera jerked sideways, the footage smearing into violent artifacts. A sound rumbled, so deep my desk vibrated. Not a roar, not a growl. The shifting of earth under strain. Trees collapsed out of frame. Something massive, taller than any device could fully capture, moved across the video's edge. Not revealing itself, just a limb, a shadow, a jointed form that didn't obey biological rules. The audio spiked again as Mara screamed Daniel's name. He finally moved, neck twitching, face tearing into clarity as if the video was reassembling him. Then, white. I thought it was over. I thought that was all. But the media player kept going, like the runtime had changed while I watched. A new image formed. The trail marker for Trail 73. The same one search and rescue photographed months later. Same cracks, same fading number. But now, fresh symbols carved beneath it. The same angular markings Daniel filmed on the trees. Only this time, they formed a sentence. A warning. Eyes make doors. The video ended for real then. Or maybe I stopped watching. I'm not honestly sure. I remember falling sideways in my chair because the room felt like it tilted with me. The shadows along my wall flickered like the hallway light was trying to sync to a frame rate that didn't belong to reality. I shut down my computer. I unplugged everything. I pulled the SD card from the reader and tossed it into a drawer. I didn't sleep again that night. Morning came. I called the ranger station nearest Trail 73. I needed to hear something normal, procedures, reports, anything grounded in the real world. The guy who answered sounded exhausted, like he'd been running shifts back to back. I asked him straight up, had there been new sightings? New missing cases? Anything unusual? Silence. Long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then, he told me they'd found something 2 days ago, near the trailhead. A camera, burned out, melted in places, as though exposed to extreme heat or pressure. And carved into the dirt next to it, fresh symbols matching the ones in Daniel's video. I asked him where the camera was now. He said it had vanished from evidence, as if someone had taken it, or something. I didn't tell him about the SD card. I didn't tell him about the video that shouldn't exist, or the voices speaking in dimensions we don't have words for. I just thanked him and hung up, my hands still shaking. The Forever House doesn't wait for anyone, and it certainly didn't wait for them. The road they traveled was more of a suggestion than a path, a single-lane dirt trail winding endlessly deeper into the forest. Towering pines crowded the sky so tightly that daylight fell in thin, reluctant ribbons. The family had chosen this place for the isolation, craving a life untouched by the noise and exhaustion of towns and neighborhoods. The listing showed a beautifully restored wooden house nestled among the trees, with no neighbors for miles in any direction. Peace, privacy, quiet, the perfect retreat. When they arrived, the house appeared almost unreal, clean and pristine, as though someone had polished every inch minutes before their arrival. The wood looked freshly stained. The windows gleamed. Even the steps to the porch seemed recently replaced. For a building said to be decades old, it looked untouched by time. The forest pressed close around the property, a dark green wall of needles and bark, letting the house sit like an island in a sea of endless trees. They carried their belongings inside as the sun slipped behind the treetops. The interior held the same impossible perfection: spotless floors, dustless shelves, walls that looked freshly painted. A faint scent of pine and something slightly metallic hung in the air. Not unpleasant, just oddly sterile for a home buried so deep in the forest. Their first night passed uneventfully, though the quiet was so thick it almost felt solid. No distant cars, no voices, no forest sounds, no owls, no insects, no snapping twigs. It was as if something had pressed mute on the entire world. Morning came wrapped in fog. When they stepped onto the porch, a newspaper lay at their feet, damp with dew, yet strangely warm, as if printed moments earlier. The date was clear, 3 days behind the current one. Odd, but not alarming. They spent the day arranging furniture, exploring the house, and settling into their new environment. As they walked through the rooms, they noticed that every light fixture held a single bulb, each one shining with the same soft, almost artificial glow. Later that evening, just after sunset, one of those bulbs flickered, buzzed, and burned out with a gentle pop, a minor inconvenience. They made a mental note to replace it in the morning. The next day, when they stepped outside again, another newspaper waited on the porch. Same date, same slight warmth, same barely smudged ink. They checked the address, but the space where it should have been printed was blank, as though the paper had never been assigned to anyone. When they returned inside and looked up at the broken bulb from the night before, it was exactly as they'd left it, lifeless and dark. But that night, just before bed, they passed the hallway again and found the bulb glowing. No footsteps, no sounds, no tools, no sign it had ever been broken. It simply worked again, as if the house refused to acknowledge the idea of damage. They tried to brush it off: exhaustion, unfamiliar surroundings, quirks of an old structure. But the details accumulated. The kitchen clock slipped behind constantly, no matter how often they corrected it. Every adjustment slowly crawled back to the same moment in time, 3 days behind. Their phones glitched only inside the house, the digital clock freezing before jolting backward by minutes at a time. Still, they stayed. Forest houses creak. Electronics malfunction. Old homes take time to adjust to new residents.
They told themselves these things because the alternative was too strange to consider. On the third morning, they noticed something new. Faint footprints in the dew-coated grass behind the house. Deep prints. Heavy, as if someone wearing thick work boots had walked the yard during the night. The path led to the far side of the house, directly beneath the bedroom windows. One set of tracks approached. One set retreated. No tire marks. No other footprints. No sign of anyone coming from the forest at all. Later that same day, the hallway light flickered and died a second time. Minutes later, while they stood near the stairs debating what to do, a figure appeared at the far end of the hall. A tall silhouette in a dull gray maintenance jumpsuit. It moved silently, with the slow, methodical rhythm of someone performing a well-practiced routine. Without looking toward them, the figure reached up, twisted the dead bulb free, and replaced it with an identical one. Then it walked toward the back of the house and vanished into a room they hadn't heard open or close. When they rushed after it, the room was empty. No footprints, no open windows, no figure in sight. They spent the next hour searching the house from attic to basement, every closet, every corner. Nothing. No man. No tools. No sign of forced entry. Only the new bulb, burning steadily overhead. They told themselves it had been a hallucination. Stress, forest isolation, the silence pressing hard against their nerves. But as night fell again and they lay awake listening to the dark, a darker silence than before, each of them wondered the same unspoken question. If it wasn't a hallucination, then who or what had touched that bulb? On the fourth morning, the newspaper on the porch carried the same date again. 3 days behind. 3 days repeating. Always 3 days. And that was the moment they began to realize. The forest around them was not simply quiet, it was holding its breath. By the second week in the house, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Every morning, without exception, the newspaper appeared on the porch with the same date, 3 days behind, never changing. The ink never smudged, never faded, never aged. As though each copy simply manifested from nothing, laid gently at the doorstep by invisible hands. They started throwing them away, piling them into a trash bin near the shed. 2 days later, when they checked the bin, every newspaper inside had vanished entirely, leaving the bin spotless as if scrubbed clean. The disappearance was not the unsettling part. The unsettling part was that the newspapers were stacked neatly on the porch again the next morning. Crisp, warm, and dated exactly the same as always. The forest itself seemed to watch them. On windless days, the tops of the pines shifted as if something enormous moved behind them, stirring the canopy without disturbing the trunks. Birds rarely crossed above the property, and when they did, their calls cut abruptly mid-air, as if swallowed whole by the quiet radiating from the house. Even inside, the air felt heavy, carrying a faint smell of warm dust and metal, like the scent left behind after a machine runs too long. The footprints began appearing more often. Sometimes they led to the shed, other times to the back door. Once to a bedroom window where they stopped without turning back. Always the same size, the same shape, evenly spaced, deeply pressed. Each set looked like the footprints of someone walking a precise route they had walked many times before. At first, the family searched for evidence of a real person trespassing on the property, but found nothing. No broken branches, no disturbed soil, no wrappers, no tools, no clues. The forest floor remained pristine except for those impossibly clean boot prints that began and ended without explanation. Time inside the house started to behave strangely. Conversations felt shorter than they should have been. Meals seemed to end without being eaten. Nights fell faster, as though hours were missing entirely. They found themselves waking without memories of falling asleep, with the strange impression of skipping forward in their own lives. They would enter a room and find objects moved, a lamp angled differently, a chair tucked in more neatly, a window cracked open that had been shut. Nothing dramatic, but collectively, an undeniable pattern. The house was not staying still. It was rearranging itself. One night, they heard a soft metallic click from upstairs, a light switch. When they looked, every bulb in the hallway glowed brightly, even ones they remembered turning off. At the far end of the hall, for a fraction of a second, they saw the figure again. The man in the gray maintenance jumpsuit. Tall, broad-shouldered, motionless. The hallway's dim yellow light seemed to bend around him, refracted by something they could not see. His face was out of view, not hidden by darkness, but distorted by distance, like a reflection on rippling water. They blinked, and he was gone. The house hummed beneath their feet, a low vibration in the floorboards, as though something large had shifted deep within the walls. After that night, they became hyper-aware of the routine. The burned-out bulb, the hallway, the quiet footsteps that echoed faintly even when no one moved. They began marking objects to see whether anything was being replaced or reset. A red thread around a bulb. The next morning, the bulb glowed with no thread at all. A small wooden wedge beneath a door. By dawn, the wedge had moved to the opposite side of the doorway. A pencil line under the kitchen clock. Gone. The clock itself still 3 days behind. The realization dawned slowly and painfully. The house wasn't being cleaned. It wasn't being maintained. It was being reset. The forest outside grew stranger with each cycle. The fog that rolled in each morning thickened, clinging low around the house like a living boundary. Beyond the trees, the world felt wrong. Not warped, but repetitive. Trees they passed looked familiar, not because they resembled others, but because they were the very same ones. The forest floor repeated patterns, fallen needles, knots in a bark, arranged too precisely to be natural. It felt like a looping animation, the background repeating just slightly too smoothly to be real. No matter which direction they walked, they always returned home without understanding how, often with the eerie sense that they had blinked and the house simply reappeared in front of them, waiting. Then came the first major change. It happened on a night when exhaustion pulled them into sleep early. Sometime in the quietest hours, the house shuddered, a soft, undeniable tremor, like the shifting of gears in a massive, unseen engine. They woke to a smell of warm electricity and something older, like dust from a sealed attic stirred for the first time in years. Walking through the house in a haze of confusion, they noticed the smallest but most chilling difference. The kitchen table had moved 5 inches to the right. Nothing else had changed, but the shift felt monumental. A line had been crossed. The house had always reset objects, but now it was starting to reset itself. Over the next 3 days, they noticed the table move again, slightly more each time. The doors creaked at different pitches. The floorboards groaned in new, unfamiliar patterns. Some nights, the stairs had an extra step. Other nights, one less. Yet they never caught the transition happening. Even the rooms felt subtly altered, as if the walls adjusted themselves whenever no one looked. They kept trying to convince themselves that they were imagining it, that isolation was twisting their perceptions. But deep down, the truth pressed in from every corner. The changes were coordinated, intentional, as though someone was tuning the house like a malfunctioning machine. Then, on the morning of the cycle's final repetition, something happened they hadn't expected. The maintenance man didn't appear at night. He stepped through the front door in daylight, crossed the living room without acknowledging anyone, and walked straight into the wall as if it were an open doorway. For a moment, the wood rippled around him like disturbed water, then smoothed back to stillness, leaving no trace he had passed through. The house exhaled a soft, mechanical sigh, and every clock in every room jumped backward exactly 72 hours. That was the moment they understood the truth that had been circling them like a wolf in the dark. The house was not haunted. The house was stuck. And whatever mechanism was forcing it to repeat time was beginning to break. The reset that followed the maintenance man's walk through the wall was different from any before. Previously, the 72-hour loop had been seamless, almost gentle. But now it stuttered, as if the cycle had been forced to restart before the mechanism was ready. There was a moment, a blink of absolute blackness, before the house snapped into a familiar configuration. The family awoke in their beds, hearts pounding, feeling as though gravity had twisted sideways. The air tasted metallic, charged, static, wrong. Outside, the forest was silent. Not the natural, restful quiet of dusk, but an oppressive stillness, as though the world itself were holding its breath. At first glance, everything looked identical to 72 hours earlier. The same newspaper, with the same outdated date, lay centered on the porch. The lamps sat in their usual places. The fog hugged the tree line in the same soft curve. But as they moved through the house, details cracked the illusion. The living room walls had shifted inward by an inch, just enough to feel like clothing washed too hot. The kitchen floorboards creaked one beat out of rhythm, a new sound in an old pattern. Even the light had changed. The sun still sat in its proper place, but the glow felt colder, flatter, as though painted onto a backdrop instead of illuminating real air. The mirrors were the worst of it. Reflections lagged by a fraction of a second, barely noticeable, but undeniably wrong. Movements echoed with ghost-like hesitation. Sometimes the reflections blinked out of sync. Other times, they lingered a heartbeat too long after the real person looked away. They covered the mirrors, but each morning, the cloths lay neatly folded on the floor. Food began losing flavor. Water tasted faintly of dust. Voices sounded flatter indoors, as though the house itself was dampening them. Time fractured. They would breathe once and find 20 minutes gone. They started marking timestamps on the walls just to track the hours, but the writing faded too quickly, sometimes vanishing while they weren't watching. Outside, the forest glitched with the same subtle wrongness. Twice they saw a crow following an identical flight loop, wings rising and falling in mathematical precision. Fog gathered in unnatural shapes, forming angular edges instead of drifting naturally. Walking deeper into the woods revealed repeating patterns of earth and moss, patches arranged with near-perfect symmetry, like tiles, like background art. Venturing too far brought them to the same invisible boundary where the forest folded in on itself. They threw a rock into the fog and heard it strike something solid almost immediately, though nothing visible blocked the way. Whatever surrounded the property was no longer wilderness. It was a container. The maintenance man continued to appear, but now his form glitched, incomplete. Sometimes only his outline flickered, like a corrupted image. Sometimes only his boots manifested, walking a path no longer aligned with the hallway. Once, he appeared upside down on the ceiling for a split second, then vanished, leaving behind a faint dark smear that hummed softly before evaporating. Whispers began leaking through the vents, low mechanical vibrations shaped almost like speech. Near the stairwell, the whispers deepened into a droning hum, like a generator struggling to turn over. They could feel the vibration in their bones, as though an engine misfired inside the walls. Then came the first visible tear. It happened in the upstairs hallway. The wall, usually pristine and smooth, developed a thin, jagged crack that pulsed faintly with light. Not bright, but unmistakably alive. A deep amber glow, like the molten core of something hidden beneath the surface. They touched it once, just once, and felt the overwhelming sensation of staring into a place they were never meant to see. A rush of unfamiliar memories flooded their minds. Looping diagrams, architecturally perfect shapes, mechanical blueprints for structures that didn't exist in the human world. Visions of the maintenance man placing objects with perfect precision, repeating the same movements again and again. And beneath it all, a rhythmic ticking, mechanical, ancient. The crack sealed itself an hour later, as though the house had noticed its own malfunction and corrected it. But the memory did not fade. If anything, it grew sharper, anchoring itself deeper into their thoughts. And with that knowledge came a realization. They were no longer just trapped. They were becoming part of the machine. Sleep offered no refuge. Their dreams adopted the same mechanical rhythm as the house. Endless hallways forming perfect geometric loops. Doors that opened into identical rooms. Clocks running backward. A voice reciting numbers too fast to grasp. They woke drenched in sweat, unable to distinguish dream from memory. Their thoughts began merging with the house's patterns. They found themselves moving objects into precise positions without realizing it. Once, one of them reached for a screwdriver in the shed, not out of need, but because something in the walls urged them to. The next reset did not come after 72 hours. It came early. The house shuddered violently, as though the mechanism had skipped a gear. Every light flickered. Every clock spun backward at once. The floorboards vibrated with a low, grinding noise. Something deep beneath the foundation roared to life, massive, ancient, like a buried engine waking from inertia. The walls bent inward for a moment, just a fraction of an inch, but enough to make the entire house feel as though it were breathing. When the cycle snapped back into place, nothing was where it should have been, not even the house. The front porch was missing. The living room had stretched 3 feet farther than before, its proportions subtly distorted. The staircase leaned left. Entire doorways had shifted, and outside, the forest was gone, replaced by a blank, empty gray expanse stretching infinitely in every direction, as though the world's rendering had failed. The family didn't want to admit the truth forming in their minds, but it was impossible to ignore. The house wasn't breaking, it was rebuilding itself. And whatever it was rebuilding into didn't look human anymore. The fourth cycle began with a silence so complete it felt as though sound itself had been erased. Not muted, removed. like a feature turned off in an unfinished simulation. The family awoke together in the living room, though none of them remembered walking there. The house had repositioned them, placing them neatly on the sofa, facing the front window as if expecting them to watch something. But outside the glass, there was only the infinite gray void, unmoving, depthless, swallowing the horizon. Neither sky nor fog, simply absence. An unfinished canvas, awaiting instructions. The house groaned quietly, a structural sound, not organic, and its walls shifted by micromillimeters, almost imperceptibly, like a machine calibrating its components. Each vibration carried a strange pressure that nudged their bodies toward the front door. Not forcibly, but insistently, the way a conveyor belt guides objects to their next position along an assembly line. When they resisted, the floor answered with a low, irritated rumble. The house had grown less patient, or perhaps less capable of maintaining its facade. They moved cautiously through the altered rooms, taking silent notes. The kitchen tiles had reorganized themselves into a perfect grid with no imperfections. The air smelled sterile, devoid of the usual wood and dust found in any lived-in space. The clocks showed no time at all. Their hands spun continuously in opposing directions, chasing cycles that never aligned. Then they found the basement door. It hadn't existed before. Where there had always been a blank section of wall, now stood a narrow doorway descending into unlit darkness. The edges of the doorway were too smooth, too newly formed, as if the architecture had been printed moments earlier. A faint hum rose from below, mechanical, steady, like the heartbeat of the house. They descended, though every step felt wrong in their bodies, as though something deep within urged them not to go further. The basement was massive, far larger than could physically exist beneath the structure above. The walls were made not of concrete or wood, but of a matte black material that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. And at the center stood a towering machine, a pillar of interlocking gears, cables, and spiraling metallic structures that pulsed with dim amber light, the same color they had seen inside the crack upstairs. This was the engine, the core, the heart of the loop. And for the first time, they understood that the maintenance man wasn't simply repairing the house. He was maintaining this. While they stared, the machine shifted with a grinding whir. Panels opened and closed like mechanical gills. Metal arms extended outward, moving with perfect precision, performing tasks too complex and too rapid for the human eye to follow. Movements rehearsed countless times across countless cycles. Then one arm malfunctioned. It stuttered, jerked twice, and halted mid-air with a sputtering noise. A new crack formed along its length, glowing amber, leaking light like something vital escaping. Immediately, the entire machine spasmed, lights flickering as if the cycle itself were destabilizing. The walls of the basement rippled like disturbed water, bending inward for a moment. Above them, the house groaned with violent frustration. The malfunction summoned him. The maintenance man emerged from the far wall without warning, phasing through solid material like a projection reloading its asset. But he was incomplete again. His form flickered, half-transparent, features blurred as if constructed from corrupted data. His movements were automatic, not conscious, a function, not a choice. He walked directly to the machine, ignoring the family entirely. His gloved hands reached for the damaged arm, performing the same precise gestures he had executed across countless cycles, even as his body jittered unnaturally, skipping frames like a broken animation. But this time, they saw something new. Behind him, in the shifting shadows of the basement, stood several other shapes, faint silhouettes, identical in posture and height. They flickered in and out in perfect sync with the maintenance man's movements, like ghosts of previous cycles overlapping the current iteration. Dozens of versions, possibly hundreds, all performing the same maintenance ritual, trapped in a recursive echo of labor. And then the realization dawned, slow, heavy, inevitable. The maintenance man wasn't a person. He was a function, a program, a repeating protocol, a necessary component of the loop. When the repair was completed, the machine pulsed with a deep, resonant thrum of satisfaction. The amber crack sealed shut. The maintenance man and all his ghostly afterimages flickered once, then vanished, collapsing into the wall as though they had never been there. The cycle stabilized again, but not in a comforting way. The house had seen them in the basement, and that was a mistake. When they climbed the stairs and re-entered the living space, the architecture had rearranged itself radically. Walls had moved, doors had relocated. The floor plan had been rewritten into a maze-like configuration. The kitchen now connected to what used to be the upstairs hallway. The front door opened not onto the porch, but into another room entirely. A room they had never seen before. That new room was vast, wider than the house should have allowed. Its ceiling impossibly high, curving gently like the inside of a massive dome. Rows of identical furniture stretched in perfect symmetry, each piece flawless, untouched. Lamps, chairs, tables, all the same. All placed in grids like a showroom, or like replacement assets waiting to be loaded into the house when needed. The house wasn't just a home. It was a facility for maintaining itself. As they wandered through the newly rewritten architecture, they noticed the world outside the windows beginning to render piece by piece. A tree appeared, held for a moment, then dissolved. A segment of forest flickered in the distance before glitching out entirely. The house was attempting to rebuild the environment, but the program was struggling. The cycle was failing. And then the ticking returned. Louder than ever, coming from everywhere at once. It pulsed through the walls, through the floor, through the air. Their vision blurred, and dark shapes formed at the edges of their sight. Human silhouettes moving in precise rhythms, their steps synchronized with the ticking. More functions, more entities, more fragments of the system tasked with maintaining the loop. And all of them turned toward the family at once. Not with emotion, not with intent, but with recognition. Like a machine identifying a foreign object that must be corrected or removed. The house was no longer ignoring them. It had labeled them. And now the system had activated the protocol designed for intruders. The house greeted the morning with a silence so heavy it felt intentional, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Anna woke first, though she didn't remember falling asleep. The last thing she recalled was the hallway bending in an impossible direction, the floor stretching like warm taffy beneath her hands, and the faint metallic scent of machinery overheating. Now she lay fully dressed atop the covers, the room tinted by a pale, mechanical dawn leaking through the warped window. Something about the light was wrong. Too white, too clean, too uniform. It felt as though the house was rendering the world outside rather than revealing it. Downstairs, she found Mark at the kitchen table, staring at the same newspaper with the same date as every morning, 3 days behind. But his expression wasn't fearful anymore. It was vacant, almost reverent, as though the repetition had hollowed him out and left space for something else to take root. She called his name, softly at first, then louder. He blinked, but didn't respond. He simply placed the newspaper down, smoothed the creases perfectly, and stood to adjust the flickering ceiling light. Anna froze. He was using the same posture, the same motion, the same quiet exhale as the maintenance man. The imitation wasn't conscious. It was instinctive. Something inside the house had begun rewriting him. The floor trembled softly beneath her feet, a pulse, like the heartbeat of an animal too large to comprehend. Anna felt the layout shift again, subtly but unmistakably. The staircase was now a few inches to the left, the living room doorway narrower. The air carried a faint electrical hum that crawled beneath her skin. The house wasn't malfunctioning. It was calibrating. She found Lily in the upstairs hallway, sitting cross-legged on the floor, tracing loops in the wallpaper with her finger. Only the wallpaper had no pattern. Yet faint, glowing outlines bloomed wherever Lily touched, as though the house recognized her gesture and responded. And the symbols she drew weren't childish swirls. They were shapes Anna had never seen, crisp, geometric, nested in perfect ratios. Lily didn't seem frightened. She seemed absorbed, focused, like someone solving a puzzle whose answer she already knew. The realizations settled over Anna slowly, with the cold clarity of a winter sunrise. The house wasn't trapping them out of malice. It was adapting them, as if they were components, pieces meant to replace the ones that had worn out before. She remembered the maintenance man replacing the bulb day after day, the exact same bulb, resetting a variable in a system with fixed parameters. She remembered the looping hours, the erasure of escape routes, the forest dissolving into white static past the fence line. She recalled the old documents in the basement, temporal desynchronization, resident-based stabilization models. The house wasn't haunted. It was broken, a machine collapsing inward, trying to preserve itself the only way it understood, by assimilating whatever remained functional. And now only 3 working parts were left in its system: Anna, Mark, Lily. A soft clanging echoed through the hallway, slow, rhythmic, steady. She knew that sound. The maintenance man's wrench tapping gently against metal as he adjusted something unseen. But this time, it came from inside the walls, from multiple directions at once, as if there were more than one of him, or as if the house was printing new ones. The light dimmed, the hallway stretched, the air thickened with heat. Anna grabbed Lily and pulled her away, but the glowing shapes continued etching themselves onto the wallpaper behind them, as if the house was finishing what Lily had started. Patterns spread across the walls like circuitry knitting itself together. Downstairs, Mark called her name, but not in his voice. It was flattened, modulated, like a recording degraded over endless replays. She saw him standing at the bottom of the stairs, posture too still, eyes reflecting the sterile white daylight that wasn't daylight at all. "Come down," he said, but his lips barely moved. The words sounded as though they came from the ventilation system, not from him. The floor trembled violently now. Beams groaned. The house wasn't collapsing. It was rebooting. Every loop, every 72-hour cycle, had been the house trying to restart without stable components. Now that the family had synchronized,
It finally had what it needed. The lights shut off. Total darkness. A single click echoed, the precise sound of a breaker flipping. White light flared through the windows, bright as a welding torch, washing out every shadow. Anna shielded her eyes, clutching Lily close. But there was nowhere to run. The room dissolved into featureless brightness, the world flattening into a blank, depthless plain. Even the air felt still, as though time itself had paused. Then a shape stepped into view, the silhouette of the maintenance man. But this time his outline glitched, splitting into after-images, then reforming. His face was not a face, a smooth, matte surface, unfinished for years, now finally being completed. He reached toward her with a calm, deliberate motion, not threatening, simply reset protocol. Behind her, Lily whispered, small, trembling, "Mom, the house is waking up." And Anna knew she was right. The maintenance man's hand hovered inches from her face. The light swallowed his outline. The walls hummed in perfect mechanical synchronization. The reboot was complete. Then, everything went silent. When the world returned, dawn spilled across the house. The ordinary, earthly kind of dawn with soft gold light and birdsong. But the calendar on the wall read the same date as always. The newspaper on the porch was neatly folded, 3 days old. Mark stood in the kitchen, humming a tune Anna had never heard, but somehow recognized. Lily traced invisible patterns in the air, smiling faintly. And Anna felt it, a shift inside her, subtle, precise, permanent. The loop had begun again. Only this time, they weren't trapped in the house. They were now part of it. The maintenance man didn't appear that morning. He didn't need to, because now the house finally had new caretakers, and it would run smoothly until they too began to break.